in this next generation. And God, we don't look down on that. I know some people can see youth ministry as being taxing or troublesome or burdensome, and it may well be those things in some ways. But we're also aware, God, that what we're trying to do is affect the trajectory of your church and to see that the next generation is sought after, is sanctified, and is making a difference in the world around them. God, it's so important that we do this with thoughtfulness and that we have wise and skilled teachers help us with this, and we're so thankful that this morning we're going to do just that. So I pray, God, please give us the awareness and the thoughtfulness to hear this, to wrestle with it in our mind, and to be well prepared, and even better prepared than we were coming in here, to help our students think about the world around them, to interpret it, and to critically discern the ways in which the world is broken. I pray, God, that you would help us with that this morning by investing in us with this great teacher, and we pray that we'd listen well and that we'd be a great audience for him, and that'd be a great experience for all of us. So we entrust this morning and what will be our afternoon to you, and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, guys, he doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'll give him one anyway, because Dr. Sean McDowell is a local, but he is a prolific writer, speaker, author, podcaster. Really, if you just type his name in Google, you're going to see tons of hits where you can find his material. But some of you are already familiar with it, or if not, you might be familiar with some of his dad's work. But he has co-authored with his father. He's done a lot of stuff that's good for the church. And I'm so excited because he is not only gifted at studying and teaching apologetics, but he's gifted at doing it to a certain demographic. And so I'm really excited for you this morning. Please give him your full, undivided attention. And please welcome Dr. Sean McDowell.
Thanks, Rod. Well, good morning. I was curious how many high school staff would be up at 9 o'clock on a Saturday. So you guys are rock stars. Hey, here's kind of the plan for the day. With a teaching background, when I get a full day, there's a temptation to say, you know what, that means I could give 6 talks. Look how much content we could get in a day. My philosophy is less is more. So we're going to slow down a little bit, take 3 topics, and kind of dissect them a little bit, meaning I've got material to present, but we're going to stop, we're going to take questions, we're going to discuss this, and make sure the questions that you have about that topic, about youth culture, about apologetics, about theology, we do our best to unpack them. So that's my goal today, is that when you're done, you walk away and you go, I understood some things, maybe I didn't before, and I have some practical things that I'm going to do. So this first session I'll tell you about in a second. Then we're going to take a break, come back, and we're actually going to look at the emerging worldview of Gen Z, some trends that are taking place with Gen Zers, and kind of a broad approach how to reach them. We come back after lunch, and you kind of think of this talk as like a 30,000-foot view talk. And then after lunch, we're going to come back and take a particular issue that's pressing today and go into some depth on it, which is the question of transgenderism. And then after that, I have a shorter talk just on 10 practical ways to teach worldview to this generation. And we will make sure there's lots of questions and answers while we're working through this. So if you have a question, make sure you write it down. We will stop and we will interact and make sure we cover that. With that said, we're going to do something a little different to start off with. I actually don't have a talk. I'm not going to give a lecture. But I brought something with me that I affectionately call my Athiest glasses. So what that means, when these glasses go on, my worldview is going to transform from Biola professor and part-time Christian high school teacher at CVCS to atheist. I'll spend about 5 minutes telling you my atheist story, which is actually a friend of mine who lives up north, and then open it up for whatever questions you'd like to ask an atheist about what I believe, maybe an evidence that you've heard or a challenge, whatever you want to ask an atheist. I'll do my best to respond in character. Then I'll take off the glasses and we will debrief exactly what happened, what we learned from it for our lives and for youth ministry. Are you guys ready for this? If not, now is the time to get more coffee. Okay, couple of things before we start. I know it's Saturday morning, people have stuff going on. If someone does come in late, will you please tell them what we're doing? Hopefully, yeah, I love working with high school folks. You're like, no, we want to see the drama. I know how this goes. I teach at Biola, and when I was an undergrad there, I'll never forget, we had a chapel. If you've been in Biola's gym, for chapel, there's, 2,000 to 3,000 students filling up the bottom, filling up the bleachers. And we had a speaker who's a missionary to Muslims. And he started off by saying, look, I'm a missionary to Muslims, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of put on this Arabic garb, and I'm going to role play a Muslim, and I'm going to give a Muslim evangelistic message in Biolas Chapel, and then I'm going to open it up for questions, and I'll respond as a Muslim might. I remember sitting there thinking, this is really interesting. I've never heard a Muslim evangelistic message. Well, he starts giving a spiel, and a student walks in the back late, not knowing what's going on. In front of the entire student body, he shouts out at the top of his lungs, word for word, "This is not the house of Allah. This is the house of the one true living God." Awkward. Clearly, he didn't get the memo. Every time I saw that guy, I was like, yep, there goes that guy. So don't be that guy. Don't be that girl. If someone sneaks in, go, psst, he's role-playing. Second, I'm not saying all atheists believe exactly as I do in character. There's a range of atheists. There's existentialists, nihilists, postmodernists, Marxists, secular humanists in terms of belief. There's also a range in attitude. About a year and a half ago, I debated a guy who calls himself the friendly atheist, kind of a YouTube blogging rock star, pretty nice guy. And then other atheists were, well, I probably wouldn't use that adjective to describe them, and everywhere in between. So it really depends on how much sleep I get. And for the first time in a week, I got decent sleep last night, so you might be in for a treat, all right? So glasses go on. And to step into atheist role play, I will only take 5 minutes roughly. Then we'll open it up and just think, what would you like to ask an atheist? I'm do my best to respond, all right? Ready or not, here we go. Good morning, Compass. Thanks for inviting me to your church. I got to admit, as an atheist, this is a rare, unique opportunity for me. Sometimes I get invited to debate Christians. I think they like to see the atheists get beat up on. Sometimes I get invited to conversations, but rarely into a church where I get a chance to speak to Christians. So just so I know, how many of you would tell me you're followers of Jesus? Let me see your hand. You're Christians. Okay, looks like most, if not all of you. I won't ask which of the 3,898 denominations you're a part of. I'll just assume you're a follower of Jesus. Is that fair? Okay, good. Well, I'm not. I used to be. Grew up in a Christian home. Actually went to a Southern Baptist church. To be honest with you, I did everything they told me I was supposed to do to be a good Christian young man. I used to read my Bible. I talked with my friends about Jesus. Went on mission trips to Mexico to build homes for the kids down there. I even got an allowance of $10 a week, and I would tithe the dollar because that's what you're supposed to do. Sing worship songs. I did it. I just believed it because that's what my parents told me. But as I grew up, I had this friend in high school, and we would debate stuff like, we debate politics, we debate Marvel versus DC, and there is no debate, by the way. We would debate sports, we debate religion. And one day she asked me some questions I hadn't really thought about before. My first thought was, well, the Bible says. My next thought was what my pastor told me. My next thought was what my parents told me. And my next thought was what I call kind of a game changer. My next thought was, I really have no idea how to answer that question. But I'm going to find out. To make a long story short, when I decided to read books that were different from what I had been told growing up, I started to realize there's not a shred of good evidence, at least scientifically, that God exists. There's no reason to think the Bible's true. I mean, it's full of far too many errors, contradictions, and frankly, immoral teachings like misogyny and slavery and genocide to come from a so-called holy God. And frankly, as I looked at the evidence, I'm not even sure Jesus existed. The evidence is really late, it's biased, it's legend-filled, it's contradictory. I think Christianity is better explained as being patterned after these dying and rising gods that predated Christianity by a long period of time. Now, we can come back to that if that interests you, but bottom line is I look at it like this. How many of you remember reading or studying the ancient Greco-Roman gods? You remember these stories? Zeus, Poseidon, Hades? Okay, most of you are nodding your heads. So when the ancient Greeks couldn't explain something like, say, earthquakes, what did they say was the cause? Poseidon, or the gods are angry. Okay, or they're trying to explain rain, what did they say? The gods are crying? Oh, they're rewarding us. Okay, I've heard mixed on this. They're crying or they're rewarding us. Regardless, what's the cause? It's the gods that do this, right? So the Greeks looked at the ground and it's moving, And they didn't have a natural explanation. So what did they do? They filled the gap in their knowledge by explaining it by appealing to God. This is called God of the gaps. Now, what happens when you keep filling God in gaps and scientific knowledge advances? What happens? Exactly, good visual. The gaps get filled, don't they? They get filled. So we used to say, oh, God's responsible for the ground is shaking, and then we learn the natural explanation of plate tectonics. We used to learn, oh, the gods are either sad or they're rewarding us because they're crying or something, and then we learn about the hydrological cycle. You see, here's the problem. What believers tend to do is they fill the gaps in our science with God. But when science advances, those gaps get filled. Now look, if you want to believe in God because it gives you comfort, gives you security, gives you community, gives you purpose, that's fine with me. Good for you. My grandmother likes to knit. My problem is when someone says it's true as if there's evidence for it and then wants to force their beliefs upon the rest of us. That's where I say time out. You better have some good secular evidence, not just appealing to an ancient book, to show me that this is true. Now, I could keep talking, but I think we'll have a much more interesting exchange. We just open it up for questions. What would you like to ask an atheist? You could ask me anything, and I'll do my best to respond. Normally, we pass around a mic, but it's small enough we can just go and be loud so everybody can hear you, and be long so I can have a sip of coffee. I'm just kidding.
What would you expect to be different if God existed compared to what we see?
What would I expect to be different? Well, it seems to me if there's a God that's all good and all powerful, we would see, if not none, an awful lot less needless, pointless, gratuitous evil and suffering. But if I see somebody drowning and I have the power to stop it, I stop it. In fact, if you're driving by and you see me and I'm looking at someone and going, hey, that person's drowning, you think I was sick. I actually have the moral responsibility to stop it. Well, the Christian God allegedly knows everything, has the power, he's good, and just watches. So I would expect the world to be very different in that regard. But I think what we do see kind of fits this Darwinian story of survival of the fittest. That's the way the world is. I guess I also expect some positive evidence that God is real instead of just stories from a time ago. So those are two things. Does that help, or did you want to know more?
I mean, that helps, but what if the person drowning sucks? Like, what if they're a bad person? So Hitler's drowning.
So Hitler's drowning?
Hitler's drowning. Do you feel bad for not?
Okay, so let's take a step back, okay? So we just punted from any normal person drowning right to where everybody goes straight to Hitler,
Well, so, like,
right? So I'm just saying, if you got to go to that extreme to make your point, I'm just pointing out that we are already kind of at the extreme point. Now, we can only use Hitler because we're this side of Hitler. We know all the evil things that he did, right? During his lifetime, a lot of people kind of knew, didn't fully know. Like, is that our responsibility to do that, or you just save somebody and let the courts figure it out?
No, but like what I'm saying is, so Christians believe that people are bad and sinful and evil by nature, right? So
You tell me. You're the Christian.
yes. So is God wrong for allowing an evil person to suffer because they're evil? Like if Christians believe that people are by nature bad and sinful,
Yeah, but
and they experience
on my understanding of the Christian worldview, humans were not inherently evil, but became corrupted because of sin. But the value comes from being made in the image of God. So even if humans made in the image of God sin, yes, they're corrupted. But you're not saying they lose their value because of that. Otherwise, you'd have to be pro-choice and all these other views I'm assuming you don't hold.
no, but I wouldn't argue they're losing their value, but if they're by nature sinful and then they are suffering as a result of sin, which Christians would say that's where suffering comes from, does that make God unjust?
So are they suffering because of sin? I guess that's an open question. Because as you read the Gospels, what does Jesus say? Sometimes he says people suffer because of sin. Sometimes he says they don't suffer because of sin.
Right, so
Like the blind man.
sins, but just like sin in general, like sin being in the world, right? corrupted the creation. That's
Okay.
what people would experience.
So why then would the Bible say, go reach the poor? Go stop suffering and care for people. Well, it's a result of sin. Too bad. Right? Like that doesn't seem to fit a Christian worldview to just say, oh, they're suffering, so it's because of sin. Too bad. As I read the Bible, you're supposed to have compassion. You're supposed to care for the poor and the widows.
Totally, yeah. But would that not be like as an act of sort of restoring the creation, being ambassadors for God? Like, so in other words, we are tasked with caring for those even though they're sinful, and caring them and telling them about the way to escape the punishment of their sin, right? So like their sin, the punishment that they would get is deserved, but we're explaining to them how they can escape that punishment. Not
Look, it doesn't have to be this difficult. There's a difference between spiritual death, the Bible talks about, and physical death, right? If somebody's suffering, are human beings supposed to try to stop them from suffering? Yeah, there we go. So are human beings better than God because God doesn't have to stop them from suffering? That's where you get into trouble. So I look at the Bible, he does things subhuman that no human would do and we would consider it righteous, like genocide and slavery and misogyny. These things are in the Bible. That's my problem. So how would the world be different? Sure seems to me if there was an all-powerful, loving, good God, you wouldn't see a lot of the things that you see. To answer your question. Yeah. Be loud just so everyone can hear you.
Sure. Within like the, do you want some evidence of how the world would be different? How would you respond to a God that would guide you, right? And you said he would be more involved in your life. Let's say you were gonna go do something bad.
Oh, we got a mic. Nice.
Oh, perfect. Let's say you're gonna go do something bad, and God says, "Well, no, I'm gonna stop you from doing that. I'm gonna like physically direct you to do something else."
Okay.
Or let's say you didn't want to do something good, and he physically directed you and like grabbed you and said, "No, you're gonna do it."
Okay.
More or less like your violation of your free will.
Yeah. What about it?
Do you think that maybe God isn't involved in our lives as much because he doesn't want to violate our free will?
I don't see any evidence that he's involved at all.
Okay.
I don't see a shred of evidence that he's involved. So I don't feel the need to say, why is he not involved more? I don't see God present anywhere. Nothing besides stories. That's my problem. If there was a God and there was evidence for it, that'd be a different question. Like, why does he do this, not that? Okay, I could make sense of maybe I don't fully understand the ways of God. But I don't find any evidence there is a God in the first place. That's my problem. Now, we might need someone to pass the mic around. Look at you. Good job. Way to take one for the team. It's actually selfish. He has a Fitbit on. He's trying to get steps.
actually I do.
So what kind of evidence would, in your opinion, be something that would actually turn you on to Christianity, number one? And then number two...
Let's start there, and then we'll come back. I would say a couple things. Number one, any of the kind of evidence we actually see in the Bible. So, like, let's set up some pillars right here. You call on your God, I'll call on mine. If God's interested in me believing him and he calls down fire, I'm in. Let's go to the tombs, raise somebody from the dead, like Lazarus. Hey, forget lunch. Let's just somebody multiply the loaves. I mean, just any kind of supernatural sign that's not equivocal, that's in the Bible, that would do it for me. Sure. We'll just stick with that.
And then the other thing is, do you believe the universe had a beginning?
I don't think we know about the state of the universe because the laws of physics as we know it break down at Planck's time, 10 to the negative 43rd seconds. So we don't know. There's pretty good evidence from multiverse. So it's not just in Flash and superheroes. There's actually good evidence for the megaverse, multiverse existing in string theory. But our particular universe, it's hard to know because our instruments break down at those initial moments. Even that oscillating machine in kind of Germany and Switzerland, to figure out what happened in those first seconds, that machine would need to be the size of like our whole solar system, which of course isn't going to happen. Although Trump might be able to do it. I'm not sure. Does that answer your question? Okay, good. I see one back there.
So speaking about scientific evidence, what would you say are scientific reasons that explain harder concepts like love or beauty or those kinds of concepts?
Oh, they're chemical reactions in the brain. That's it. I mean, you can come back if you want to, but that's all they are. They're chemical reactions in the brain that have evolutionary explanations and reasons for them. Yeah, it's a feeling that we have. That's it? Is that all you want to know? I want to make sure you can follow up. Okay.
I'm trying to figure out how to put this in a couple things, but we're talking about evil and bad and this and that. Well, how do you define that? Like, where are you getting that from? If it's just there is nobody directing the universe and there is nobody in charge, so you might think it's wrong, but who says it is? Who says you're right?
Well, clearly not the Bible. And I'm assuming you don't either. I'm assuming none of you own a slave.
Well,
I see a lot of women talking here in a church. So clearly you take exception to things in the Bible. You don't believe in genocide, I hope. That would be my assumption. So clearly even you have a certain standard when you look at the Bible and go, yeah, that's right, that's wrong. That's a common human capacity that we have. It's called empathy. It's part of being human. So we can look at our behavior, see how it affects other people, and make assessments about how our behavior affects others. It's honestly, it's not that hard. Now, you and I would come about finding right and wrong pretty similarly. We just point to a different source. You'd say, well, it's in the Bible. And I'd say, no, it's just we can see this as being human. Its effects on other people, effects on society. And so killing somebody, stealing something from somebody, takes their right to life, and it also hurts society as a whole. So it's wrong.
So we're kind of going back to his question, like a start, like you said, chemical reactions, or we know these things. Where did any of this matter, start? We don't know, but there is a truth about what happened, even if we don't know it.
Now, I agree with that. I agree with that. Neither of us are postmodernists. That's good. There is a truth. That's right. So your question for me is, where did it all start?
Yeah, because we're here, right? So we've got
I agree with that.
Functional bodies. There's there's matter. There's all this. How could it come from nothing? Like, it had to have a start, right? And as we know, like you said, there's chemical. We know right and wrong. We know emotions. So there's something there.
Did it have to have a start? Because you believe God is eternal and didn't have a start. So if God can be eternal and not have a start, why can't the universe or the megaverse? I mean, we both exist. We both agree something can exist and not be caused. Mm-hmm. You say God, I say the universe. Why is that superior?
So even though we see the intelligence that you're saying doesn't have to be a designer, because you're saying where is the designer then created? Is that your argument there?
Wait, what intelligence?
So the intelligence you have, the intelligence I have, that there's an intelligence in the universe that we're saying begs for an intelligent designer.
So, obviously I don't agree with that. I think it can be explained by evolution.
So we get the complexity of the brain and the body and like you're even saying the rain, the earthquakes, comes from just randomness?
No, because that's not what the process of evolution describes. That's a straw man.
Well, there's an intelligence in evolution, right?
There's a difference between saying the neo-Darwinian synthesis, the modern synthesis, is capable of generating complexity and intelligence, and saying that my position holds that it just came from randomness. Those are not the same things. So I don't think it just came from randomness. I think the modern synthesis is well supported, overwhelming in the fossil, geological, paleontological, etc. evidence for this evolutionary story. And we actually can see increased complexity in the eye. We can see increased complexity in emotional capabilities and intelligence as we work up the evolutionary trail. We can actually see this within the fossil record and looking at different organisms. There's no mystery to it. I just don't think we need to point to an intelligence to be able to describe it when we have a sufficient natural explanation. That's it. But if you had evidence that God did this and the natural mechanism was insufficient, I would be open to it. I just don't see it. That's it. Like, faith is not enough for me. You blindly believe something without evidence. Just show me that it's true. That's it. That's all I'm asking for. And I would believe. That's it. I see a question over here. Good. You guys got the idea. Questions as far apart as we can. Get the man steps.
You led into my question beautifully because you were talking about evidence.
Good.
Well, I'd love to know what you think about Jesus Christ being alive and living a perfect life and dying on the cross and being resurrected. You know, this wasn't like Paul says in the Bible. I know you don't believe the Bible, but Paul tells us even that this wasn't done in a corner. It's not like he did this in a corner hiding. I mean, a lot of people, tons of people saw this happen. It's recorded in historical documents. So when you say there's no evidence, I'd love to know more about that.
Okay, so that's a huge question. From the existence of Jesus, the writings of Paul, the Gospels, the death, the resurrection. I mean, I could talk for hours about this, but here's my general response, and then you can push and prod where you want me to go, is that yes, the Bible records that a lot of people saw Jesus, right? It says, for example, 500 saw Jesus. Look, that's 500. But I go, okay, wait a minute. Do we know where this happened? No. Do you know when this happened? No. Do we know a name of a single person in that group of 500? No. Do we have another source that backs this up? No. It's one citation from Paul, written 1,000 miles away, decades after this event. Wouldn't hold up in a court of law. So I agree with you that the Bible reports these things. But if you start pressing, saying, why should I trust the Bible as a reliable historical source, let alone inspired, that's where it starts to fall apart for me. So there's contradictions in the biblical account about the death, resurrection of Jesus, pretty blatant contradictions, and we could talk about those if you want to. There's bias in the accounts. I mean, the end of John, what does he say? He says, I'm writing these things so you will believe. In other words, it's propaganda. It's propaganda. Not to mention, we see the same story of Jesus long before in these dying and rising gods, the ancient Near East, Adonis, Mithras, Isis, etc. I mean, Mithras, this ancient Persian god, do you know the story is born of a virgin, lived a sinless life, performed miracles, had 12 disciples, was a teacher of righteousness, died and resurrected on the third day. Hundreds of years before the story of Christ. I used to think the Christian story was unique. And I realized, oh my goodness, it's just copying these stories that exist before. That's my general one. We could prod some of the particulars if you want me to, but I just don't buy it purely historically speaking.
Well, there were other historians, though, that didn't even believe what was going on, but they were writing it because they were historians.
Like who? Name one.
Pastor PJ, help me out. Because, what's the guy? Thank you.
Josephus did not mention Jesus of Nazareth. He did not. Now, he mentioned 33 people by the name of Jesus, by the way. It's like saying Jesus mentioned John or Michael. He didn't mention Jesus. And you say, wait a minute, what about the Testimonium Flavianum, which is Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 18? The earliest copies we have of Josephus don't include that statement about Jesus dying because it was added later. We know this from a 10th century Arabic manuscript. That was added later, not in the first century of the writings of Josephus. So Josephus does not mention Jesus in any fashion that's reliable historically. There's not a single first century writer outside of the scriptures, which I think are written in the early second century, that attests to this person Jesus. There's not. That's my problem. If you just push a little bit, this story that you're being told starts to fall apart. Starts to fall apart. Okay. Look, I'm not here to rob your faith. You're asking me, so I'm just trying to give you an honest answer of how I've processed these questions. Go ahead.
I'm just curious to know your view, like why you are born as Sean McDowell, a human being and not a cat or a dog. Like who decides that?
My
Is
parents.
it a random thing? Yeah, but I mean, you could have born as an ant or a rat, something, but who in the beginning decides that? The chromosomes or the DNA that people talk about in every human being or natural living thing, how does it exist from the beginning?
So I don't know that I fully understand what you're asking. Are you asking like the first life from non-life? Are you asking when humans merged from a different animal? Are you asking like my parents?
I'm saying that God has, as Christian, God has planned that from the beginning, that I will be born as a human being and serving Him and glorifying Him in my everyday life. But that's in my view, it's God who decides that I will be born as a human being. But as an atheist, how do you see it how you are born as a human being and not as something else?
Because I guess what's called the principle of biogenesis, the things reproduce after their kind. It's really that simple. I don't find any evidence that a God picked me or didn't pick me. If your parents are human, pretty good chance you're going to be human. Now, there can be slight change that accumulate over time, but that's what's biologically called the principle of biogenesis. And I think maybe this is a difference between us. Because we have scientific evidence of how things reproduce and biologically change over time, I don't feel the need to bring God into the conversation. If that helps you, that's wonderful. Like, good for you. I just don't find any evidence that God picked me or picked you ahead of time. So to believe in that, might as well believe in Santa Claus.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I just had a question about how you believe that our understanding of science and everything ultimately proves our existence and all of that. But our understanding of science and all of that continually changes and then disproves itself. For example, like hundreds of years ago, we thought erroneously the earth is flat, and we all know, right? We all know it's not. And then, right? And then also, during my childhood, we disproved that Pluto is a planet when for years, we thought it was. And other things too, like bleeding out patients would somehow heal them.
Slow down. I get the point. So let me take a couple of these examples. The first one was about the earth being flat. Here's the deal. Hundreds of years ago, people did not believe the earth was flat. This is a myth. This is a myth. If you read the ancient Greeks, they actually know the earth was round hundreds of years before the time of Christ. Because of the reflection of the earth on the moon. Why do you think there's a shadow that's round? Because that's coming from the sun, from us to the moon. You actually got on a ship. If you looked out long enough, you can actually see the tip of a ship start to disappear because it's round. So people knew the earth was round long time ago. It's a myth that Columbus set out thinking that it was flat. What was your second example?
That we thought for a long time that Pluto was a planet.
Oh, okay. So all that changed, nothing changed with Pluto, is our definition of what a planet is and whether Pluto qualifies as a planet. So we have a certain definition of what it means to be a planet. We could expand that definition in the name of inclusiveness and diversity and welcome Pluto into the group. So it's not like the facts changed or the science changed. We just clarified certain understandings for the sake of scientific precision. That's it. Now, are there some things we believe that we discovered are false? Sure, of course. This is the beauty of science. Unlike theology. See, in theology, if we discover, oh, wait, there actually wasn't the conquest of Jericho around the time the Bible depicts, you can't change the story and follow the evidence. You have to change the evidence to match the story. See, theology is wedded to an ancient book. Science says we'll follow the evidence wherever it leads. So yes, there's been mistakes, but science always self-corrects. It's science. If we couldn't trust science, you think we could land on the moon? You think we could be talking right now over a microphone? You think you'd have a smartphone? What about travel, communications? All these things come from science. What does religion give us? Wars, diversity, and homophobia. That's it. We get time for maybe 3 or 4 more questions.
I'll try and keep mine brief then. So I want to just go back to talking about origins of the universe, stuff like that. You've been very emphatic about the importance of scientific evidence for all of this, but when you were pushed on the question of, where did the universe come from, stuff like that, you admitted that basically everything we know, all our instruments, all the rules that we know about physics break down when you're talking about basically the initial moments of the Big Bang. Is that correct?
only under Planck's time.
Right.
Now, that doesn't mean we don't have a reasonable inference of where the universe came from. That doesn't follow. I could go into that. But yes, when it comes to those initial moments, our ability to peer into that breaks down. That's correct.
Right. So there's basically no scientific evidence that we can have from our perspective based on our current scientific tools to actually talk about the origins of the universe in a meaningful fashion.
No.
Okay. What is
that? Doesn't follow.
Okay. Please explain why not.
Well, we have a few things. Number one, when you look in quantum mechanics, quantum physics,
Yeah.
we see uncaused things happening regularly. We can actually observe this. So whether it's electrons spinning apart and some of the details involved in that, whether it's electrons popping into existence uncaused, we have precedent for these kind of things and don't need to punt to God to explain it. So discovering an origin of the universe, the only way is not looking at the instruments in those few initial seconds.
Sure, yeah, you're saying things just pop into existence and we don't know why. So you're positing magic for the existence of things.
I don't remember using the word magic. We
no,
can actually
but
observe
what
these
you're describing
happen.
is magic. Things just come into existence uncaused. Things just pop in.
No,
I mean,
I don't-
a car could suddenly start to exist into this room.
Yeah, but the difference is there's not a shred of evidence that a car does that. If a car popped into existence, I'd say, okay, that's probably some kind of magic. But we see and we observe this with electrons because of what we know about quantum mechanics. These things,
Which
like,
is almost nothing.
actually, that's not true.
I mean, we can see things pop into existence and we don't know why. And you're just positing, oh, well, they just pop into existence. You're actually, basically, you're saying, oh, well, we can't explain it, therefore we can't explain it. You're just saying the same thing over and over again.
No, I'm not. But if that makes you feel better to assume that I am and not listen to my evidence, then
Okay,
feel
no, explain.
free to keep
I'm curious what
repeating
your
that,
evidence is.
if that's helpful.
No, what's your evidence? I haven't heard any yet.
Well, I've given it twice. Sounds like you're not interested in hearing the evidence. But if you actually read, for example, the book The Grand Design by Stephen Hawking, arguably the greatest scientist of our day, he walks through and actually describes how because of quantum mechanics and what we understand about it, we should expect to see these kind of things emerge. Now, are we still learning some about quantum mechanics? Yeah. But your statement, we know nothing about it, just simply, that's not true. We have books full of knowledge and understanding of how Newtonian laws break down when we get to the micro level. We can actually observe this happening. We don't have to posit God as an explanation when we can see it happening naturally. Now, is it logically possible there's some God hiding behind this? Sure. Now, we know it's not the Christian God for different reasons. I mean, I could give you dogmatic reasons why we know the Christian God doesn't exist. But could there possibly be some God out there? Sure.
Yeah, so let's just look at that narrative. So you're basically saying that things can pop into existence based on some rules that we don't really understand, or you can posit that some being is behind that, causing those things to pop into existence. Now, based on our present
I
experience...
wouldn't frame it that way, but fine.
Well, okay, frame it how you would frame it, but the reality is that's the way that you're essentially positing. You're positing things come into existence based on a set of rules we don't fully understand, or you can posit that things come into existence, as Christians do, based on the actions of some actor that we don't fully understand. Now, given our present experiences, we tend to find that things come into existence because an actor has created them. Something has caused them. Things generally don't come into existence for lack of a cause. I mean, if you do that, you break down the entire rules of logic, right?
No, not the rules of logic.
I mean, logic only can work from cause to effect. So, I mean, how are you going to posit that? I mean, if
rules of logic are different than rules of physics and cause and effect. Those are not the same.
Rules of physics based on rules of logic.
Need to be kept separately. Here's the thing, though. We actually can posit and see and detect uncaused things happening. This isn't a mystery. But we can't detect. We can't see. We don't have a shred of evidence for a God. That's why these things are not empirically equivalent. One is, well, there might be a God back there making this happen. The other one is, well, we see it happening. This is a part of the natural world in which we live. So why add a God on top of this? That's all I'm asking is for some good evidence that God exists. Because if you say God exists, you bear the burden of proof. And if you say God caused the universe, you're obviously left with the troubling question, what caused God? It doesn't solve anything. In fact, it stops scientific pursuit from moving forward.
Okay, so let me just address that real quick, right? I mean, the standard Christian answer to that is God is uncaused because God has always existed. And so God doesn't need a cause because God has always existed. Only that which begins to exist needs a cause. But I'd like to pivot to that
Which
second.
that's really easy to say, right? Oh, God just exists, doesn't need a cause. Then why can't the universe?
Because all our scientific evidence indicates that it did have a beginning, right?
That's
we have
not
the
true.
Big Bang, we have thermodynamics, we have the rules that show that the universe
None
is
of that
expanding.
proves that the
potential
megaverse
energy-
had a beginning. None of that does. It
Right.
might be consistent with it, but it doesn't prove it. To say all the scientific evidence does, even Jeff Zweerink get reasons to believe. Who believes in God is like, no, there's good scientific evidence against it having a beginning. So that's an overstatement. Last question, because I have a
Okay.
feeling
Yeah,
you've always got something to correct.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we could go back and forth on the details of this all we want. I mean, there's a narrative distinction in how we're approaching this.
What's your last question?
Yeah, my last question goes to the question of good and evil. And so you posited earlier that...
Okay, hold on. Let me give someone else a chance. You completely shifted to something else.
Yeah, I did.
Let me give somebody else a chance. As hard as it is to give up the mic, let's give somebody else a chance here.
Hi. So I'm going to go back to the whole beginning question and approach it a little bit differently. I know that you said that there's evidence for, at least on the atom level and even electrons, that those have popped into existence. I get that. But that's different than the whole universe popping into existence. So it doesn't seem like there's enough evidence, at least from a scientific explanation, to really kind of prove your theory. So at least can you admit that it takes a certain level of faith in what you believe it from a secular level, that you have a certain level of faith that's kind of like our faith, where you have a certain worldview and you apply that to science?
It's a good question, by the way. No. I would not concede that there's any faith. There's a difference between faith, which is believing something without any evidence. And you see in the story of Thomas, Jesus castigating the demand for evidence in John chapter 20, and reasoned conviction, which is what I have. So no scientists say we can explain everything. We go where the evidence leads. If the evidence points a certain direction, even if some questions are remaining, that's the more reasonable position to go. So I wouldn't use the term faith because it has a religious connotation of believing things apart, without, against the evidence. That's not what scientists do. Do I think I have it all figured out? No, definitely not. Wouldn't claim that I have it all figured out.
That's it. I just wanted to hear you. If
Okay.
at least you're open to if for some reason there was some evidence, if God
sure.
came into your life.
I'm open to it.
Great.
Yeah,
Then
I'm
I'll leave
open
it
to
there.
it. Just haven't heard any or seen any. One more. Better be good. Last one.
I'm old. I'm curious, you haven't addressed the spiritual realm at all. What do you believe about the spiritual realm? Does it exist? Is there a kingdom outside of our naturalistic area?
So that's a good question. I don't find any evidence for an immaterial reality. So for example, I don't believe in, say, heaven or hell. No, I don't believe the narrative or any evidence that those exist. I don't believe in angels or demons. I don't believe there's good evidence for soul. Mm-hmm. I mean, we actually, probably I would assume, correct me if I'm wrong, that you think when your body dies, your soul goes to be with the Lord, at least for a season, right? Is that fair? You're nodding your head? I don't find any evidence for an immaterial soul. In fact, we actually know. We've seen people get brain damage, and what happens in a certain area of their brain changes their personality. We've seen this, right? Why? Because personality is not in some immaterial soul. It's just seated within the brain. So I don't find any evidence for a spiritual realm, although I'd be open to it. I just don't find any evidence that's real.
So when you die, that's it?
That's it.
Okay.
Yeah, same with you.
I'm closer than you are. All right. Thank you.
That answers it. Mm-hmm. All right. The atheist is gone. He's out of here. Do you clap? Yeah, I never know if people clap because they're like, man, good job, or we are glad the atheist is gone. Leave. We're clapping because you're out of here. And you don't have to answer which one of those it was. All right? So first off, take a deep breath. Just go, I don't believe almost anything that I just said, okay? So take another deep breath. I don't want any of you to wake up at midnight and go, God, that atheist made some good points. I think I'll become an atheist. I would never get invited back to Compass, and that'd be sad on a number of levels. So I don't believe almost any of that. We're going to come back and unpack some of these questions that came up. But here's a question for you first I'm curious about. As a whole, how do you think you treated your atheist guest? He gives a little thumbs down, sideways. Individual words, I'm curious. Rough, respectfully. We've got a spectrum here of generational differences. That's okay. What's that? As an other. What does that mean? I'm not, and you said that with a little pizzazz. I like that. Like, you're not like us. That's awesome. Okay, as an other. What do you think?
Probably like you're clearly wrong, not like, oh, you might be right on something.
So in a closed-minded, we're going to tell you why you're wrong approach is how you read it. Okay? Anybody else? What do you think? Cordially? Okay. All right. Anyone else? What do you think? Okay. Okay, that's true. It was pretty impersonal. I agree. Fair enough. I gave a little bit of background. Told you my story of my friend. Anybody else? Would you say patient, gracious, kind? Maybe, maybe not. So I've done this. I did this here with the women's group. How many of you here when I did this with the women's group? 1, 2, 3 guys. No, I'm kidding. 3 women. That makes sense. I've done this in groups this size to a stadium in the Philippines with 8,000 people where I set up microphones. And I think that was a little too much. I was like, this is almost unmanageable, 8,000 people. And everywhere in between. This was pretty typical response, just so you know. It was fine. But one thing I've discovered is, well, let me take a step back. So I was doing this in a stadium with about 6,000 junior hires and high school students in Minnesota. And I start off, and I turned around to begin, and this group of students go, boo, boo, go home, Mr. Atheist. And youth pastor shouts out, you're going to hell, like shouts it out. So I went off script and was like, well, wait a minute. I know I don't believe like you do, but I was invited to come, and they knew I was role-playing, share my presentation. Why would you boo me? Why'd you shout I'm going to hell? Like, do you think Jesus would engage somebody that way? What about Paul? Like, look on Mars Hill. That doesn't seem to be his tactic. I said, in fact, even in your Bible, 1 Corinthians 13, it says, this chapter of love, it says, if you speak in tongues and give prophecies but don't have love, you're like a clanging cymbal. You have nothing. I said, in fact, even Jesus was accused of being a friend of sinners. He said, love your enemies. The entire stadium was silent, which proves there's a God because junior hires were present. I have one who's 12, so I can lovingly pick on him. The next summer, it was 1 or 2 summers later, I was speaking in Salt Lake City, maybe 500, 600 students, and I turned around to start, and this group of students, front, middle, maybe a dozen of them, instantly go, woo-hoo-hoo, we love you, Mr. Atheist, and that kind of caught me off guard. Usually there's like tension. So I went to him afterwards, I was like, why were you cheering for the atheist? They said, well, we were part of the group that booed you in Minnesota. And instantly I thought, oh, they got the point. They got the point. See, I studied at Biola as an undergrad. I was a communications major. And very simply put, there's 2 broad components to communication. There's the medium and there's the message. The medium is the way we communicate something. It could be through body language. It could be through a text. It could be through a written letter, which doesn't exist anymore. It could be through a tweet. And a message is the content that we aim to deliver, the medium and the message. You know what's interesting about the Christian story? When God ultimately wanted to reveal himself, the message, what did he do? He took on human flesh, entered relationally into our world. You see, Jesus came in grace, relationship, and he came in truth. It's both. Grace and truth love and truth. I think Christians err on one of two ways today. Either we say, I'm God's prophet, I'm speaking truth. If it hurts you, that's on you, I speak truth. Well, that's a mistake if it's not done in love. We also see a huge trend in the church that says what? Hey, maybe the loving thing to do is to soften the seemingly offensive things in Scripture. Hell, that's offensive. I got to soften that. Jesus is the only way. Maybe Jesus didn't really mean it. God says marriage is one man, one woman for life. That's harmful, and soften it. That's a mistake. That's a mistake. Christians, we are called to speak truth unequivocally, but to do it in love, not to win an argument, not to sound smart, not to prove somebody wrong, but to do it in love, because it is love that sets people free. And don't mishear me, I'm not saying this is a niceness contest. It's not. The gospel is offensive. It is offensive. That's why the road is narrow, right? It's a stumbling block to the Greeks. It's offensive to the Jews, or I think I maybe got that backwards. But you meant what I knew? There's something the rest of you will get that at midnight. If you ever speak and you say something you didn't mean, you go, oh, you meant what I knew, and just then move on. And I totally lost my train of thought. What was I saying? Stumbling block to the Jews, offensive to the Greeks. The gospel is offensive. But let us not turn people away from the truth and goodness of the gospel by failing to love them as people. It's both. It's grace and it's truth. I was speaking at camp a few summers ago, and I spoke all week. And I don't know, maybe gave a dozen talks, and I kicked off doing this role play. And these students were as defensive and testy as any group I can remember. And finally, this girl kind of back middle left stands up. She goes, Mister, I just want to read you something. I said, okay, what do you want to read me? She said, from the Bible, the holy word of God. I said, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in the Bible. She goes, I don't care. Listen up, and points at me. She's going to be a great parent someday. She reads to me Psalms 14:1. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. I said, so you're publicly calling me fool. She says, the Bible says it. That settles it. You're a fool, mister. And her friends go, woo-hoo-hoo, like give her five and they sit down. Now, not to mention, she completely distorted the meaning of that passage. It's not talking about atheists. It's talking about people who don't live like it's true, not what you abstractly believe. But we'll leave that aside. A student came to me afterwards. Whenever I do this with students, I always spend time unpacking it afterwards. I won't just leave them hanging like, go get them, read a book. Like, that's not going to work with students. And this girl waited till everybody was gone, probably an hour plus. She came up to me. She goes, thanks for doing your best to defend atheism. I said, sure, why are you thanking me? She goes, well, I'm an atheist. I said, really? How'd you end up at this Christian camp? She goes, well, I am a leader in my youth group. I said, I feel like I'm missing something here. She said, I've grown up in the church my whole life, and I started to have questions. The response I got was, well, just read the Bible. Just pray about it. Don't have doubt. Doubt is sin. And like, they didn't take my questions seriously. I started to realize, I don't even believe this anymore. I said, well, have you told anyone? She said, you're the first person I've told. I said, why don't you tell somebody else? I'll never forget what she said. She said, because I'm afraid they'll treat me like they just treated you. That was, I remember that moment going, gosh, how do we treat people as Christians? This is over a decade ago. And it's like God started to put on my radar the jokes we laugh at, the stories we tell, the words we use, the labels we give. Communicates a ton in terms of the medium that shapes how people process the message. It's grace and it's truth. By the way, you know what studies consistently show, especially out of Fuller Theological Seminary, their sticky faith research, is that it's not questions and doubts that drive a young person away from the faith. You know what it is? It's unexpressed doubts and questions. In other words, when a young person doesn't feel the freedom to say, this just doesn't make sense to me. Did a donkey really talk? Was there really a snake in the garden? Like, how did God create the world? if they don't feel the encouragement and the freedom to ask questions, that's what rocks their faith. So it's worth asking ourselves. I don't only ask this to give reflection. I always ask this to every group I speak at. I say, if there's atheists or non-believers observing our group, what would their assessment be? Don't answer this out loud, just for thoughts. And I wish you could be a fly on the wall all the time. I've done this with students and with pastors and with other groups. I mean, it's an exception to find somebody who graciously and lovingly can ask the right, thoughtful question to unlock a good spiritual conversation. It just is, as a whole. I had a girl come up to me after one time, and she goes, "Guy, you must really get discouraged in your job." And I said, "Why? I actually love my job." And she goes, "Because people in their group, they're like, they were such jerks." Like, is that your experience consistently with the church? I said, well, not always that bad. It was particularly egregious. But her perception was like, gosh, we Christians are not great at engaging the non-believing world with kindness and with graciousness. So I wrote a book. I didn't bring it, but about almost a decade ago. It was a different book. Sorry. You just went, oh. It was a book I wrote called Is God Just a Human Invention? When the new atheists were really hot, like a decade ago, kind of wrote a response to it. And a lot of the stuff that came up, like faith being blind, origin of the universe, evidence for the soul, like we addressed some of those. And Christians were reading it, it was getting good feedback. I thought, it'd be cool if I could get some atheists to read this and tell me what they think. So I called up the Free Thinking Society of Orange County here. And that's not, the Backyard Skeptics was the name of this group. And they're kind of a little bit north of us. And I said, hey, my name is Sean McDowell. The guy's like, I know who you are. He had seen me debate at Saddleback College a few years ago against a teacher at that time who was at Capitol Valley. He had seen it. And he goes, I know who you are. I said, look, here's what I'll propose. I'll bring a box of my books, just give them away for free, and I'll sit in the hot seat. And you guys and all your skeptical buddies can ask me anything you want to ask a Christian. Now, I don't know about you, but that actually sounds like fun to me. It's not because I think I have all the answers. I'm fine saying, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. Let me get back to you. It doesn't bother me. So I drove there with my wife and my pastor, and we went kind of north, more towards the area of Orange, went into this home, and there were about 20 skeptics, sat on a hot seat for somewhere between an hour and a half and 2 hours, and they asked me questions I anticipated and some I didn't, like, when do you think the soul enters the embryo? I was like, don't think I saw that one coming from a group of atheists. Here's what I think. Well, during that session, what was very interesting is this guy turns to me, he goes, he's the head of it, his name is Bruce. He goes, no way. And I was like, no way what? He goes, I can't believe it. And I'm like, you can't believe what? He goes, you actually have a sense of humor. He said it like that, like he was really taken aback. And first off, I'm like, I try, but I'm not that funny. There's people a lot funnier than I am, and I'm okay with that. But why was he so surprised? Because Christians, in his experience, are like Angela on The Office. He said to me, he's like, kudos for coming to our group. I can't believe you'd have the guts to do this. I'm like, why? Shouldn't Christians be going to groups like this? Not to get in arguments, but to meet people, to listen, to build relationships. Isn't that what we should be doing? So at the end of it, I asked them, I said, could I have 15 minutes just to ask you guys some questions? Now, I could have asked them, how do you get something from nothing? Okay, and that line of reasoning, and a few of you went on, is a good line of reasoning. Okay? Basically, the atheist, when it comes to the origin of the universe, can say the universe has always been here, but that runs up against the scientific and philosophical evidence for a beginning. Or they can just say, we don't know, and be agnostic about it, but that betrays the claim that atheism better explains reality. Or they can say that something comes from nothing, which basically is magic. And it is kind of absurd, except in magic, there's a magician and there's a hat, right? So I could have pressed them on that. Fine, there is no good naturalistic explanation for the origin of the universe. But I do think the beginning of the universe points towards a beginner outside of space and time. Could have asked to explain the origin of life. There is no naturalistic explanation how you get life from non-life. When you look at the complexity and amount of information in the cell, I think it cries out for an author of life. There's no explanation for the fine-tuning of the universe. There's no explanation for objective morality without God. There's no explanation for the origin of consciousness. Atheism can't explain any of the big questions that require explanation. I could have pressed him on all of these, but I didn't. Instead, I said, I'm curious. What bad impressions do Christians leave? In other words, I asked him questions about relationships in the medium rather than the message. A lady sitting right in front, she might have been about 70, she goes, listen. I said, what do you mean? She said, my Christian friends really want to preach at me, tell me why I'm wrong, occasionally tell me I'm going to hell, but they don't want to listen to me. Why should I listen to them when they don't listen to me? Like, that's a simple, fair point. A fellow in the back who had a website at the time trying to debunk Christianity, although his son was a Christian at Biola, which was interesting. He goes, stop the atheist jokes. I was like, man, dang it, I have some good ones. Actually, the word he used, word for word, he goes, stop slandering atheists. I said, like, that's a pretty serious charge. What do you mean? He goes, look, I'm an atheist. He goes, somewhat frequently, I'll go sit in the back of a church and just observe. I've had a few of my atheist friends tell me this. I'm sure you have some atheists come to your youth group, come to college group, come to college. And I asked him, like, why do you come? He goes, because church is just interesting. Like, have you ever thought about how weird church actually is? I'm going to write a blog this week. Like, yes, Christians, we are weird. I'm not saying trying to be weird. That's a very different thing. But think about it. We were singing in my church not long ago. The words are up on the screen. It's like thanking Jesus for the blood. Now just stop and think about that. You walk in a building, you don't understand Christian theology, and people are like, thank you for the blood. Either it's a medical cult, it's a cult or a medical convention. Like, it's actually weird. Why do you pray and hold hands and then squeeze at the end of it? Like, why? Everybody just does it. There's actually weird things we say and talk, oh, I'm blessed, like we don't even realize. So he's like, I just go watch. He goes, every time I go, from stage, I hear some cheap shot against atheists or some non-Christian group. He goes, every time. And inside, I squeeze my wife's knee, and on the way home, I'm like, that guy is a complex, right? You show up looking for something because you're a victim. I'm like, that guy's over the top. Within like 2 weeks, I'm sitting in church. And the pastor tells a joke at the expense of atheists. And this time my wife squeezed my knee. She goes, see, that guy was right. I thought, oh my goodness, I think he was. Part of when I do this with students is not so much the answers, but to say, where's your heart with this? This is a heart issue. Because if we approach our non-believing world like, I'm right and you're wrong, you're the other, I'm going to win an argument and show you you're wrong for my pride or something else. I often tell people who enter our apologetics program, I'm like, don't do our apologetics program. Go do like spiritual formation because you need that first. You're going to do more damage than good if it's not motivated by a heart of love. That's one reason. The second reason, obviously, it did this is 40 minutes. Did you notice, maybe 30 minutes, I don't know how long it went. The more we went, the more the frustration kind of brew, right? The more as I push and say things and make up facts. Yes, I did make up some things, by the way. I'll own it. What happens? The frustration grows. It grows. Can you imagine our students? Not just one class with a professor like this. I'm not saying every professor would be like this. Sometimes the most damaging professors are those who just dismiss Christianity as if it doesn't even matter. It's not even worth discussing. They just dismiss it. But all our students will have one or two professors like this. The question is, are they prepared ahead of time going in? So some people have said, why do you try to really defend atheism? I say, because if I stand up here and I do a straw man, I actually don't do you any good. I don't do the students any good. I had an atheist after I did this. He came up to me and goes, man, you defended atheism better than I could. And I'm an atheist. I said, you want to hear why I'm not?